What if I told you that some of the strangest, most unbelievable laws in American history weren't written by satirists or screenwriters? That actual elected officials, sitting in actual government chambers, voted yes on legislation so bizarre, it sounds like it came from a fever dream? You probably think this is going to be one of those lists about small towns banning ice cream on Sundays. Maybe a quirky rule about not tying your horse to a fire hydrant. But some of what you're about to hear goes so far beyond quirky that your brain is going to reject it on instinct. And that's exactly why it needs to be said out loud. Every single law on this list was real, passed, signed, enforced, and in many cases, sitting quietly on the books for decades before anyone thought to question it. These aren't urban legends, they aren't internet myths. They are documented pieces of American legislation that actually governed real people's lives. So before we get into it, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, because this kind of history tends to get buried and I need your help making sure it actually reaches people. Share it with someone who thinks they know American law. Trust me, they don't. Not all of it. Now get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights because we're about to go through 50 of the most jaw-dropping, head-scratching, completely real laws ever put on paper in the United States. Some of them will make you laugh. Some of them will make you uncomfortable. And a few of them are going to make you genuinely wonder who exactly was in charge when these things passed. Let's find out. 1. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Let's start with a law so morally catastrophic that just reading about it feels like a gut punch. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 didn't just allow the capture of escaped enslaved people in free states. It legally required ordinary citizens, shopkeepers, passers-by, anyone, to actively assist in that capture. If you refused, you could be fined. If you helped a person escape, you could be imprisoned. Free Black Americans in the North lived in constant terror because the law didn't require much evidence. An affidavit from a slaveholder was often enough to drag someone south in chains. People who had been free for years were seized and enslaved. The accused had no right to a jury trial, no right to testify on their own behalf. The federal government had essentially turned free states into an extension of the slave system. And the law worked exactly as intended. 2. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. If the previous law made you think we'd learned something about codifying discrimination, hold on to that thought. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was the first and only major federal law in American history to explicitly bar a specific nationality from immigrating based on race. Chinese laborers who had built the Transcontinental Railroad, who had quite literally stitched the country together with iron and steel, were suddenly barred from entering. Those already here were barred from becoming citizens, no matter how long they had lived in America. Merchants, teachers, students faced constant documentation requirements that no other group did. The law was supposed to last 10 years. Congress renewed it, then made it permanent. It wasn't fully repealed until 1943, and only then because China was a wartime ally and the optics had become inconvenient. 60 years of legal exclusion, entirely based on where someone was born. 3. The Comstock Act of 1873, and speaking of the government deciding it knew better than everyone else about extremely personal matters, the Comstock Act of 1873 made it a federal crime to mail contraceptives, information about contraceptives, or anything the government deemed obscene through the United States Postal Service. That included medical textbooks. That included letters between doctors and patients. That included pamphlets explaining basic reproductive health. The law was named after Anthony Comstock, a postal inspector who was so personally offended by the existence of human sexuality that he lobbied Congress into giving him the power to enforce it himself, which they did. He was appointed a special agent of the post office and spent decades confiscating mail, prosecuting publishers, and driving medical professionals to ruin. At least 15 people were driven to suicide after being prosecuted under this law. Women were denied access to information about their own bodies by federal statute. The Comstock Act technically still exists in federal code, though courts have narrowed its reach significantly. And speaking of laws that reached into places they had absolutely no business being, the next few items are going to feel very familiar. 4. The Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. If you've ever been told that America has always cherished free speech, this next set of laws laughs in your face. In 1798, with war against France seeming possible and partisan politics absolutely feral, the Federalist-controlled Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. On paper, these laws were about national security, making it easier to deport dangerous, non-citizens and harder for immigrants who tended to support the rival Democratic Republicans to become voters. In practice, they turned political disagreement into a crime. The Sedition Act made it illegal to publish false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the federal government, the president, or Congress. Not threats, not calls for violence, just harsh criticism. If you printed a newspaper editorial mocking President John Adams, you could be fined thousands of dollars and jailed. And people were. Editors of opposition newspapers were prosecuted, some for basically roasting the administration in print. One congressman was arrested for criticizing Adams in a speech, then re-elected from his jail cell. The Supreme Court never even reviewed the law. It simply expired in 1801 when Adams lost and the Federalists were voted out. The people most responsible for passing the Sedition Act never had to defend it in court. It was so obviously un-American that later generations sort of pretended it had never really counted. But it did. The United States criminalized political criticism at the federal level within a decade of ratifying the First Amendment. 5. The 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act, if the Comstock Act, was the government saying, "We know what's best for your bedroom." Prohibition was Washington deciding it knew what was best for your liver. The 18th Amendment, ratified in 1919, banned the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors in the United States. The details of how to enforce that were hammered out in the Volstead Act, which defined intoxicating as pretty much anything over 0.5% alcohol. Wine, beer, spirits, gone. The movement behind this had deep roots in religious revivalism, women's activism against domestic violence, and earlier temperance campaigns. Reformers blamed alcohol for poverty, crime, and broken families, and they had a point about how bad things could get. Their solution, however, was to amend the Constitution so the federal government could police everyone's drinking habits. Overnight, millions of ordinary people became criminals for brewing beer in the basement or running a small neighborhood bar. The black market exploded. Organized crime blossomed into an empire of bootlegging, bribery, and violence. Speakeasies flourished. People drank anyway, sometimes industrial alcohol that had been deliberately poisoned to discourage consumption, killing or blinding thousands. Enforcement was wildly inconsistent. Wealthy people stockpiled wine cellars before the ban and drank comfortably for years. Doctors could prescribe medicinal whiskey. Priests and rabbis could still use sacramental wine. Eventually, the whole thing became a national joke that also happened to be deadly. After 13 years of chaos, the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th in 1933, the only time a constitutional amendment has been fully canceled by another. It took rewriting the Constitution just to admit that a nationwide alcohol ban had been a terrible idea. 6. The Mann Act of 1910. And if you think governments only learned once from trying to legislate morality, the Mann Act shows they were just warming up. Officially called the White Slave Traffic Act, it was passed in 1910 during a moral panic over white slavery, the belief that innocent young women were being kidnapped and forced into prostitution in huge numbers. The law made it a federal crime to transport any woman or girl across state lines, for the purpose of prostitution or debauchery, or for any other immoral purpose. That last phrase was doing a lot of heavy lifting. Immoral purpose was never clearly defined, which meant prosecutors and judges could treat consensual relationships as crimes if they disapproved of them. Men were arrested for taking girlfriends on trips, for interracial relationships, for affairs, for anything that offended local sensibilities. One famous case involved heavyweight champion Jack Johnson, a black man prosecuted for traveling with white girlfriends. The government couldn't prove coercion or trafficking, so they charged him under the Mann Act anyway, because interracial relationships were seen as immoral. He was convicted by an all-white jury. The law that was supposedly about rescuing victims of forced prostitution was regularly used to punish adults for private consensual sex. It became a tool for political payback, moral crusades, and racial control. Over time, Congress narrowed the language to focus more explicitly on trafficking and coercion, and courts limited its reach. But for decades, The Mann Act was a federal statute that let prosecutors criminalize relationships they didn't like simply by drawing an invisible line on a map and calling crossing it immoral. 7. The Dawes Act of 1887. If the Mann Act blurred the line between protection and control, the Dawes Act took that logic and applied it to an entire continent of land. Passed in 1887, it sounded, on paper, like a kindness, a law to give Native Americans their own plots of land, turn them into independent farmers, and integrate them into American society. In reality, it was a surgical tool for dismantling tribal nations and stealing everything that wasn't nailed down. Before Dawes, most native land was held communally by the tribe. The law said no more of that. Instead, reservation land would be cut up into individual allotments, 160 acres for a head of household, less for single adults and children. Once those allotments were carved out, anything left over was declared surplus and sold to white settlers, railroads, and speculators. The government held the allotted land in trust for 25 years, supposedly to protect native owners from being swindled, but also to control whether they could sell it, mortgage it, or even leave it to heirs without federal say-so. Citizenship was sometimes dangled as a reward for accepting allotment, making it sound like a civil rights measure instead of what it was, a land grab wrapped in the language of reform. Between 1887 and 1934, Native Americans lost about 90 million acres of land, roughly 2/3 of what they still held when Dawes passed. Tribal governance structures were undermined, communal economies shattered, and traditional ways of life deliberately targeted under the banner of civilizing and uplifting people who had not asked to be improved. Officials described this as making Indians into Americans, as if centuries of culture, law, and land tenure could be overwritten with a few homestead forms and a plow. It wasn't until the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 that the federal government officially admitted the allotment experiment had been a disaster and began halting it after the land was already gone. 8. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, and if the Dawes Act was about breaking what was left, the Indian Removal Act was about clearing the map in the first place. In 1830, with cotton money flooding the South and white settlers hungry for more land, President Andrew Jackson pushed Congress to pass a law that basically said, move them all west. The Indian Removal Act didn't, on its face, order mass expulsions. That would have looked a little too honest. Instead, it authorized the president to negotiate treaties exchanging native land in the east for territory west of the Mississippi River. The problem was that the negotiations were backed by constant threats, violence, and legal sleight of hand. When the Cherokee Nation took Georgia to court and actually won in the Supreme Court, recognition that they were a distinct political community with rights to their land, Jackson allegedly responded, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." Whether he said those exact words or not, the policy was clear. The court could rule, but the army answered to the president. Between the 1830s and 1850s, tens of thousands of native people, Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, and many others were forced on long, brutal marches to Indian Territory, mostly in what is now Oklahoma. Those journeys, remembered as the Trail of Tears, killed thousands through disease, exposure, starvation, and exhaustion. The so-called treaties justifying removal were often signed by tiny factions claiming to represent whole nations, then ratified by a Congress happy to pretend that consent existed. The new lands out west were promised forever, a word that shrank every time white settlers decided they wanted something, gold, roots, or just space. Removal wasn't an accident of history or an unfortunate side effect of progress. It was a policy, written into law, debated, voted on, and signed, with the explicit goal of opening native homelands to white settlement and profit. 9. The Anti-Bootleg Coal Act of 1941. And while some laws targeted people's land, or bodies, others went after what they scraped from the ground with their own hands. The Anti-Bootleg Coal Act of 1941 sounds like a parody of prohibition. Sorry, sir, is that contraband anthracite in your trunk? But it was very real. During the Great Depression, in coal regions of Pennsylvania and elsewhere, thousands of unemployed miners and poor families turned to bootleg mining, sneaking onto company lands or abandoned shafts, digging coal with hand tools, and selling it on the side to survive. From the perspective of desperate communities, it was subsistence. From the perspective of big coal companies and the federal government, it was theft, unfair competition, and a threat to the heavily regulated wartime energy market. So Congress stepped in. The Anti-Bootleg Coal Act made it illegal to transport or sell coal produced in violation of state law, effectively federalizing the crackdown on small-scale, unauthorized mining. It didn't just go after the guys with pickaxes. It targeted truckers, middlemen, and anyone who knowingly handled bootleg coal, turning backyard survival economies into criminal conspiracies. Supporters wrapped it in the language of safety and order. Bootleg mines were dangerous, unregulated, prone to collapses and accidents, and there was truth to that. But the solution wasn't to offer safer, sanctioned ways for miners to make a living. It was to protect established companies and price structures by criminalizing the informal coal trade that had kept entire communities from starving. In classic American fashion, the law approached an economic and social crisis not by asking why people were risking their lives in illegal mines, but by making it a federal offense to help them sell what they dug. 10. The Pink Bullworm Act. If the Anti-Bootleg Coal Act was about protecting big energy from desperate miners, the Pink Bullworm Act was about protecting big cotton from a tiny moth larva. In the early 1900s, the pink bullworm, an invasive caterpillar that burrows into cotton bolls and ruins the fiber, started crawling its way toward the American South, and you would have thought an invading army was massing at the border. Cotton wasn't just a crop, it was an industry, a power base, and for a lot of powerful people, practically a religion. So instead of just issuing some agricultural guidelines, Congress passed a federal law aimed at one specific bug. The Pink Bullworm Act authorized sweeping quarantine powers. Federal and state officials could cordon off entire counties, restrict the movement of cotton plants, seed, and even lint, and order the destruction of infected fields. Farmers who'd already been hammered by price swings and debt suddenly found that the government could tell them when they could plant, what they could ship, and whether their harvest had to be burned in the name of pest eradication. The logic was that one careless bale could spread the worm and devastate an entire region, so individual property rights took a back seat to collective crop security. Inspectors could stop trains, seize cotton, and regulate gins in warehouses, all because of a caterpillar most people would never actually see. The act helped slow the insect spread, but it also showed how quickly Washington would mobilize extraordinary powers when the threat was to commodities, not people. 11. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918. And if Congress was willing to go to war with a caterpillar for the sake of cotton, it went to war with fashion for the sake of birds. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, women's hats became a kind of slow-motion extinction event. Milliners stuck feathers, wings, and sometimes entire stuffed birds onto elaborate headwear. Certain species were slaughtered by the millions just to decorate the latest trend. Egrets were killed during nesting season so hunters could harvest the delicate aigrette plumes that grew when they were breeding and caring for chicks. Songbirds vanished from eastern forests to reappear in shop windows. Conservationists, many of them women, pushed for years to stop the trade, but states had a patchwork of weak or easily ignored laws. The solution ended up being international. The United States signed treaties with Britain for Canada, and later with Mexico and others, agreeing to protect migratory birds that crossed borders. To enforce those promises at home, Congress passed the Migratory Bird Treaty Act in 1918. Overnight, it became a federal crime, no matter what your state said, to hunt, capture, kill, sell, or even possess many birds, their nests, or their eggs without a government permit. Farmers who shot herons, fashion houses with storerooms of feathers, egg collectors, and casual hobbyists all found themselves suddenly on the wrong side of a treaty-backed statute. The law didn't just regulate hunting seasons, it treated the entire life cycle of protected birds as a federal interest, turning nests and unhatched eggs into something like living contraband. It's one of the reasons some species recovered instead of vanishing entirely, though it also meant that a kid picking up a cool feather could technically be committing a federal offense. 12. The Lacey Act of 1900. And if the Migratory Bird Treaty Act wrapped a protective bubble around birds and their eggs, the Lacey Act went broader, turning wildlife itself into a kind of legal minefield. At the turn of the 20th century, America had a poaching problem, but not the romantic kind with lone hunters sneaking into estates. Commercial hunters and traders were vacuuming wildlife out of one state, then shipping it across state lines to sell where local laws were weaker or non-existent. A state could ban the sale of certain game animals. But once those animals were packed in crates and sent on a train, that law stopped at the border. Congress's answer was to make the border the weapon. The Lacey Act of 1900 made it a federal crime to transport, sell, or buy fish, wildlife, or later plants that had been taken, possessed, or sold in violation of any state, tribal, or foreign law. In other words, if it was illegal where it came from, it stayed illegal all the way down the supply chain, even if everyone who touched it afterward was in a place where the item was perfectly legal on paper. That meant a hunter who shot game out of season, a middleman who shipped it, and a shopkeeper who sold it could all be dragged into federal court, not because Congress banned that species itself, but because someone, somewhere, had broken a local rule. Over time, the act expanded to cover illegal logging and plant trafficking, so a mislabeled crate of timber or exotic reptiles could trigger felony charges. It was one of the first major federal wildlife laws, using the Commerce Clause like a net, pulling a messy tangle of state and foreign regulations into one big federal offense, and turning the act of shipping the wrong bird, fish, or board of wood into a potential ticket to prison. 13. The Federal Anti-Lottery Law of 1895. If the Lacey Act weaponized interstate commerce against poachers, the Federal Anti-Lottery Law turned the mail system into a moral police force. In the late 1800s, lotteries were everywhere. Churches ran them, civic groups ran them, and some states basically funded their budgets by selling chances on rigged drawings. The most notorious was the Louisiana Lottery, a private company that bribed politicians, mailed tickets nationwide, and advertised itself as the golden octopus because its tentacles reached into every part of American life. Reformers hated it. They saw lotteries as engines of fraud and addiction that drained wages from workers and farm families who could least afford it. Congress, leaning hard into its favorite move, didn't try to regulate gambling directly everywhere. It cut off the arteries that fed it. The 1895 Federal Anti-Lottery Law barred lottery tickets, advertisements, and prize lists from being transported across state lines in interstate commerce and through the U.S. mail. You could still technically have a lottery in a state that allowed it, but the second you tried to send tickets or promotional material over a border, you were in federal territory. The post office became an enforcement arm, seizing mailings, refusing delivery, and effectively choking off a national industry by starving it of its distribution network. What started as an anti-fraud effort quickly blurred into moral crusading. The same machinery used to block lottery circulars would later be used to block birth control information and obscene literature. The anti-lottery law helped crush the Louisiana lottery and shrink national gambling, but it also set a precedent. If Congress didn't like something and couldn't ban it outright, it could still strangle it by weaponizing the mail truck and the railroad car. 14. The National Firearms Act of 1934. And if Congress used the mail to go after lotteries, it used the tax code to go after certain kinds of guns. By the early 1930s, the image of the American gangster was practically a brand. Tommy guns blazing out of car windows, sawed-off shotguns in bank lobbies, bootleggers with machine guns turning city streets into war zones. High-profile crimes like the St. Valentine's Day Massacre made it clear that ordinary state gun laws weren't exactly scaring organized crime. But outright federal gun prohibition was politically toxic and constitutionally shaky. So lawmakers reached for a familiar workaround: taxation as regulation. The National Firearms Act of 1934 didn't ban machine guns, short-barreled rifles and shotguns, or silencers. It buried them under paperwork and money. It imposed a $200 tax on the manufacture and transfer of those weapons, an astronomical sum at the time, roughly equivalent to several $1,000s today, and required every covered firearm to be registered with the federal government. To legally buy or sell a machine gun, you had to fill out detailed forms, submit fingerprints and photographs, get law enforcement sign-off, and wait for Washington to approve your tax stamp. Failure to comply wasn't just a regulatory slip-up, it was a federal felony. The idea was that gangsters, who weren't big on filing honest paperwork anyway, would either avoid these weapons or get nailed for tax violations, the way Al Capone had been taken down for income tax evasion. The law also created a national registry of especially dangerous weapons, embedding the idea that certain gun types warranted federal tracking and control. Over time, the NFA has been amended and litigated endlessly, but its core logic remains. If Congress can't or won't directly outlaw something, it can make owning it so expensive and bureaucratic that only the most determined and most documented will ever bother. 15. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914. And if the National Firearms Act turned tax forms into a gatekeeper for guns, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act did the same for drugs, long before anyone talked about a war on drugs. At the turn of the 20th century, opiates and cocaine were shockingly ordinary in American life. Laudanum, morphine, and cocaine-laced tonics were sold over the counter. Patent medicine makers promised to cure everything from toothaches to women's troubles with bottles that were basically legal heroin and sweet syrup. Doctors prescribed opiates for chronic pain, coughs, and even mild anxiety. Addiction was widespread, but it wasn't yet a crime. It was treated more like an unfortunate medical condition or a private shame. Progressive reformers, moral crusaders, and racial panics all converged to change that. Newspaper stories stoked fears of cocaine-crazed black men in the South and opium dens corrupting white women in Chinatowns. Direct federal authority to ban drugs outright was murky, so, again, Congress used taxes as a crowbar. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 required anyone who imported, produced, prescribed, dispensed, or sold opium or coca-based drugs to register with the federal government, pay a special tax, and keep detailed records on official forms. On paper, it was just a revenue measure, and a way to track legitimate medical use. In practice, federal agents and courts interpreted it aggressively, deciding that doctors who maintained addicts on steady doses were not really treating them and were therefore violating the act. Physicians who continued to prescribe to dependent patients risked arrest, prosecution, and prison. Overnight, what had been a medical relationship became a potential criminal conspiracy. Addicted patients were pushed out of pharmacies and doctors' offices and into black markets and street dealing. The Harrison Act didn't use the word prohibit, but it effectively criminalized addiction and many forms of treatment, laying down the legal skeleton that later drug prohibition laws would flesh out. It showed again how a tax law could quietly rewire everyday life, turning bottles on a pharmacy shelf into contraband and transforming a public health problem into a criminal one. 16. The Espionage Act of 1917. If the Harrison Act quietly turned a medical issue into a crime problem, the Espionage Act of 1917 quietly turned dissent into something that could look a lot like treason. When the United States rushed into World War I, the Wilson administration was terrified that criticism of the war would sap morale, weaken the draft, or worst of all, encourage people to resist. So Congress passed the Espionage Act, which on paper was about punishing spies and people who interfered with military operations. In practice, the language was so broad that it criminalized almost anything that could be framed as obstructing recruitment or causing insubordination or disloyalty in the armed forces. Mailing anti-war pamphlets, that could be a crime. Giving a speech urging people to resist the draft, also a crime. Socialist leader Eugene Debs was sentenced to 10 years in prison for a speech that criticized the war but didn't actually tell anyone to do anything specific. Newspapers that questioned the war effort had their mailing privileges revoked. The Supreme Court upheld these prosecutions, coining the clear and present danger test, while upholding the idea that in wartime, free speech could be heavily curtailed. The Espionage Act never went away when the war ended. It just sat there, waiting. The Sedition Act amendments were repealed, but the core espionage provisions remained. Decades later, the same statute wrote the charge sheets for whistleblowers and leakers, Daniel Ellsberg for the Pentagon Papers, Chelsea Manning for Iraq and Afghanistan war logs, Reality Winner for an NSA report, and multiple counts against Edward Snowden. Because the law doesn't distinguish between an actual spy selling secrets to a foreign power and someone giving classified documents to the press, prosecutors can, and do, treat both as essentially the same crime. The Espionage Act became a permanent emergency measure, letting the government decide when telling the public what it's doing crosses the line from journalism into felony. 17. The Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917. And if the Espionage Act gave the government a powerful tool against information it didn't like during wartime, the Trading with the Enemy Act gave the president a financial magic wand, one that has been waved long after the gun stopped firing. Passed just months after the U.S. entered World War I, the law was originally sold as a straightforward wartime necessity. It authorized the president to regulate, prohibit, or license trade and financial transactions with enemies and their allies. On one level, that meant obvious things: seizing German-owned ships in American ports, freezing enemy bank accounts, controlling exports of strategic materials. A new office, the Alien Property Custodian, literally took control of factories, patents, and companies with enemy ties, selling them off or holding them until the war ended. But the language of the act was loose enough that it did more than just deal with German firms in 1917. It created the idea that, in a declared national emergency, the president could unilaterally grab control of economic levers, imports, exports, currency, foreign-owned property, and lock them down. That emergency logic proved contagious. In the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt leaned on amendments and related emergency powers rooted in this framework to close banks and restrict gold hoarding. During World War II, German, Italian, and Japanese assets were again seized or frozen under its umbrella. Over the 20th century, Congress kept grafting new powers and new emergencies onto the same basic trunk. By the time of the Cold War, it had become a toolkit for economic sanctions: Cuban property frozen after the revolution, North Korean and Iranian assets locked in American vaults, whole countries cut off from the U.S. financial system by presidential order. Even when Congress later tried to rein things in with the International Emergency Economic Powers Act in the 1970s, it ended up formalizing the idea that the president could declare a national emergency and instantly control a vast amount of economic life. A law meant for a world war about Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany still echoes today every time you hear about sanctions freezing billions of dollars in assets with the stroke of a pen. 18. The Emergency Quota Act of 1921. And if the Trading with the Enemy Act gave the president sweeping power over money and trade, the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 did something similar to the flow of human beings, by literally turning census figures into a gate. For most of the 19th century, the United States barely restricted immigration at all, aside from openly racist exclusions like the Chinese Exclusion Act. Ships packed with Europeans sailed into New York Harbor, and federal law mostly just screened for disease. But by the early 1900s, anxiety about too many newcomers from Southern and Eastern Europe, Italians, Poles, Jews, Greeks, mixed with eugenics theories and fears about radical politics. After World War I, Congress decided America needed a pause. Their pause took the form of math. The Emergency Quota Act capped immigration from any given country to 3% of the number of foreign-born people from that country living in the U.S. as recorded in the 1910 census. That sounds technical, but it was a racial sorting machine disguised as statistics. Because the U.S. population in 1910 was still dominated by earlier waves from Northern and Western Europe, using those numbers as the baseline meant newer groups from Italy, Russia, and elsewhere got tiny quotas. Old stock immigrant groups from Britain, Germany, and Scandinavia got much more generous slots. On top of that, the law slapped an overall annual ceiling on immigration, something that had never existed before on that scale. Emergency became the justification for fundamentally changing who could enter the country and how many. Families who might once have joined relatives in New York or Chicago suddenly found themselves stuck in bureaucratic lotteries and endless waiting lists, or turned away entirely. The act was supposed to be temporary, but it set the structure that the even harsher Immigration Act of 1924 would build on, locking in national origin quotas based on an even earlier census. Those rules shaped the demographic makeup of the United States for decades, favoring some groups and nearly excluding others, not through explicit racial language, but through quiet percentages and old headcounts written into federal law. 19. The Immigration Act of 1924. If the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 quietly turned census tables into a sorting machine, the Immigration Act of 1924 took that prototype and hardened it into a long-term blueprint for who was allowed to become American and who would be kept outside the gates almost entirely. Lawmakers were very explicit about their goals, even when the statute's language sounded technical. Politicians talked openly about preserving American stock, protecting the country from the wrong kind of Europeans, and defending against an imagined tidal wave of radicals, paupers, and undesirables. So instead of scrapping the quota system, Congress doubled down. They replaced the 1910 baseline with the 1890 census, which might sound like a minor bookkeeping tweak, but it was the whole ballgame. In 1890, the big waves of Southern and Eastern European immigrants, Italians, Jews, Poles, Slavs, Greeks, had barely begun. That meant those groups had far fewer people on the books, and a 2% quota based on that earlier snapshot produced microscopic numbers. Quotas for places like Italy or Russia shrank to almost nothing, while Britain, Germany, and Scandinavia enjoyed comparatively generous slots. On paper, the law claimed to be neutral. No explicit racial categories, just national origins. In practice, it was a eugenics project translated into bureaucratic math, written by people who literally cited race science and Nordic superiority in their debates. The law also did something else. It essentially slammed the door on almost all immigration from Asia. The earlier Chinese Exclusion Act had already carved out one group, but the 1924 Act broadened that idea by refusing to give quotas to nations whose people were ineligible for citizenship under existing naturalization rules, rules that themselves were race-based. That created what was effectively an Asiatic barred zone by a counting trick. Japanese diplomats protested loudly. In Japan, the law was perceived as a profound insult, feeding long-term resentment. For would-be immigrants across Europe and Asia, the practical result was simple. Numbers that had once allowed millions to enter now dropped into the tens of thousands for favored countries and a few hundred or zero for others. Steamship tickets became a gamble, visas a rare prize, and families that expected to reunite in America learned that a line item in a federal statute had turned their dreams into an arithmetic problem they could not solve. Those quota formulas, with only minor tweaks, stayed in place for 4 decades, meaning the snapshot of who America thought it wanted in 1890 kept shaping who could actually come until the Civil Rights era. 20. The National Origins Formula. And if the 1924 Act was the skeleton, the National Origins Formula was the nervous system that animated the whole thing, an elaborate statistical gadget that took prejudice, ran it through a calculator, and produced numbers that looked objective on the surface. Instead of simply counting foreign-born residents by country, Congress decided to get even more precise. They ordered demographers and bureaucrats to estimate the entire national origins makeup of the U.S. population as of 1920, including descendants of earlier immigrants going back generations. The stated goal was to align immigration quotas with the existing ethnic composition of the country, as if they were carefully preserving a delicate demographic recipe. The unstated, but openly discussed, goal was to lock in the dominance of what lawmakers called the old American stock from Northern and Western Europe. Committees pored over census data, immigration records, and frankly pseudo-scientific assumptions about who counted as what. They devised formulas that tried to assign every American to some ancestral national origin, then turned those percentages into annual immigration slots. If, for example, they calculated that 60% of Americans were of British and German origin, then roughly 60% of future immigrants would ideally come from Britain and Germany. The result was a self-reinforcing loop. The groups most represented in the existing population got the largest quotas, which kept them dominant in future generations. At the same time, tiny estimated percentages for Italians, Poles, Jews, Greeks, and others produced tiny quotas, making it nearly impossible for those communities to grow through new arrivals. People from Africa and Asia were largely written out of the math altogether. In speeches and reports, officials talked about protecting American homogeneity and preventing the U.S. from becoming overrun by supposedly less assimilable groups. The formula ran quietly in the background of immigration law from 1929 until 1965, adjusting numbers each year but never changing the basic premise that the ideal immigrant looked like an echo of America's past, not a glimpse of its future. Refugees fleeing fascism in the 1930s and genocide in the 1940s ran headlong into those arithmetic walls. Even in the face of humanitarian catastrophe, the quota tables rarely budged. When historians later tried to explain why the U.S. admitted so few Jewish refugees before and during World War II, they kept running into the same culprit. Ledger sheets filled with neat columns of national origin numbers, written to maintain a demographic status quo. By the time Congress finally abandoned the national origins formula in 1965, it had quietly sculpted the country's population for nearly half a century, doing with percentages and projections what more openly racist statutes had done with blunt language. 21. The Smith Act of 1940, and while the quota system tried to control who could come into the country, The Smith Act of 1940 zeroed in on people already here, policing not where they were from, but what they believed and what they said about the government. Passed on the eve of America's entry into World War II, the law made it a crime to advocate the violent overthrow of the U.S. government, to organize a group around that idea, or to be a knowing member of such a group. On its face, that might sound reasonable. No one wants an armed conspiracy plotting a coup. But the language didn't require proof that anyone was actually planning concrete actions. Teaching or even discussing revolutionary theory, if prosecutors could frame it as advocating overthrow, could be enough. The law also created a requirement that non-citizens register with the government and made it easier to deport people for political affiliations. During the war, the act mostly sat on the shelf or was used in a few high-profile cases, like prosecuting fascist sympathizers and fringe figures accused of spreading Nazi propaganda. After the war, though, as the Cold War and Red Scare heated up, the Smith Act became a central weapon against domestic communists and other radicals. The Justice Department brought sweeping cases against leaders of the Communist Party USA, not for planting bombs or stockpiling weapons, but for holding meetings, reading Marxist texts, and maintaining a political organization that, in theory, endorsed revolution somewhere in the indefinite future. Trials turned into ideological theater, prosecutors introduced party literature as evidence, and juries were asked to decide whether the mere existence of a communist party posed a clear and present danger. Dozens of party leaders were convicted and imprisoned. The Supreme Court initially upheld these convictions, effectively blessing the idea that abstract advocacy could be criminal if the ideas were considered dangerous enough. Over time, as the hysteria of the early Cold War faded, the court narrowed that reading, ruling that only incitement of imminent, concrete action could be punished. Many Smith Act convictions were overturned, and by the 1960s, prosecutions under the statute had largely stopped. But the law never vanished. It remains on the books, a reminder that in moments of fear, Congress has repeatedly tried to legislate against dangerous thoughts as much as dangerous deeds, blurring the line between punishing violent plots and criminalizing unpopular ideas. 22. The Neutrality Acts of the 1930s. If the Smith Act imagined dangerous ideas incubating inside the country, the Neutrality Acts of the 1930s were Congress's attempt to build a legal moat around the entire United States, in the hope that if we just refused to touch anything sharp overseas, the storms of another world war would somehow pass us by. After World War I, a lot of Americans convinced themselves that the carnage had been pointless, and that Wall Street bankers, arms manufacturers, and idealistic presidents dragging us into European quarrels were to blame. So when dictators started marching again, Japan invading China, Italy attacking Ethiopia, Hitler testing the limits of the Versailles Treaty, Congress's response wasn't to pick sides. It was to write statutes that tried to make picking sides illegal. The first Neutrality Act in 1935 banned selling arms to countries at war and warned American citizens not to sail on belligerent ships, as if the ghost of the Lusitania was still steering policy. A year later, lawmakers expanded the rules to include loans and credit, trying to cut off the financial entanglements they believed had pulled the U.S. into the last war. By 1937, the laws were broadened again: no arms, no loans, and mandatory cash and carry for non-military goods, meaning foreign buyers had to pay up front and transport everything themselves. On paper, these were even-handed, applied equally to aggressors and victims. In practice, they helped the most powerful militaries and punished the countries being invaded. When Italy attacked Ethiopia, both were treated the same under American law: no arms sales, no special help. When Spain's elected government fought a fascist revolt, the U.S. declared both sides belligerents and barred arms to either, a policy that hit the poorly equipped Republicans far harder than Franco's well-supplied rebels. President Franklin Roosevelt, who saw the danger from Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan more clearly than most, spent years pushing against the constraints his own party had helped create, quietly warning that when peace has been broken anywhere, the peace of all countries everywhere is in danger. By 1939, as war broke out in Europe, Congress grudgingly revised the acts to allow arms sales to Britain and France on a cash and carry basis, a loophole that slowly tilted U.S. policy away from strict neutrality. But the basic idea that laws could wall the U.S. off from global conflict turned out to be fantasy. When German submarines started attacking American ships and Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, the legal fiction of neutrality collapsed overnight. The Neutrality Acts didn't prevent war. They mostly limited how early and how effectively the U.S. could respond to rising authoritarian regimes, proving that sometimes staying out of it is itself a powerful choice, with very real consequences for people far beyond your borders. 23. The Bonus Army Eviction Orders of 1932. While the Neutrality Acts tried to keep American lives from being spent in foreign wars, the Bonus Army story is what happens when the men who already paid that price come home and discover the government would rather use bayonets and tear gas than cash the check it wrote to them. During World War I, Congress had promised veterans a bonus for their service, but structured it like a long-term savings bond, certificates that wouldn't fully mature and be paid out until 1945. That sounded responsible on paper, but the Great Depression shredded the assumptions underneath it. By the early 1930s, millions were out of work, and many veterans were desperate, unemployed, homeless, and watching their families slide into destitution, while the government insisted their reward was still more than a decade away. In 1932, tens of thousands of them and their families converged on Washington, D.C., creating a sprawling encampment of tents, shacks, and makeshift kitchens along the Anacostia River and in abandoned buildings around the city. They called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force, or Bonus Army, a dark joke tying their new march to the expeditionary forces they'd once been part of in Europe. Their demand was simple: pay the bonus early. The House passed a bill to do just that, but the Senate killed it, and President Herbert Hoover dug in against the idea, citing budget fears. As the summer wore on, the presence of thousands of impoverished, increasingly frustrated veterans within sight of the Capitol became a political embarrassment and a security concern in the eyes of the administration. In late July, after a minor clash between some protesters and police left 2 veterans dead, Hoover authorized the use of federal troops to restore order and clear the camps. The Army, under General Douglas MacArthur, rolled in with cavalry, infantry, tanks, and tear gas against unarmed veterans, many wearing their old uniforms and their families. MacArthur exceeded Hoover's instructions, pursuing the marchers across the river, burning their shantytown, and driving them and their children out of the Capitol under clouds of gas while the city watched. Photographs and newsreels of soldiers attacking former soldiers shocked the public. A government that wouldn't spend money on its veterans had found plenty of resources to evict them by force. The crackdown helped doom Hoover's already faltering presidency and became a symbol of how far institutions were willing to go to protect stability over relief. A few years later, under Franklin Roosevelt, Congress finally passed a bill to pay the bonuses early, effectively admitting that the demand had been reasonable all along. But for the men who'd coughed on tear gas while retreating from their own capital, the lesson was hard to forget. The promises made in wartime can look very different when the war is over, and the country decides it has other priorities. 24. The Emergency Detention Act of 1950. And if the Bonus Army showed how the government could treat veterans as a threat in the middle of a depression, the Emergency Detention Act of 1950 revealed how lawmakers, gripped by Cold War panic, were willing to write entire categories of potential enemies into law, people who hadn't done anything yet but might someday, in some imagined crisis. Tucked into the broader Internal Security Act, often called the McCarran Act after its sponsor, the detention provisions were essentially a legal infrastructure for domestic internment camps, drafted just a few years after the Supreme Court had upheld the wartime incarceration of Japanese Americans, and then, as the war ended, quietly tried to pretend that precedent didn't say anything about the future. The new law empowered the president to declare an internal security emergency if there was an invasion, a declaration of war, or even just insurrection or subversion on a large scale. Once that emergency switch was flipped, the Attorney General could detain people suspected of being likely to engage in espionage or sabotage on the basis of lists and classifications maintained in advance. No need for a criminal charge, a trial, or proof of a specific act. Suspicion plus a label could be enough to land someone behind barbed wire. The targets were mostly imagined as communists, fellow travelers, and members of so-called subversive organizations, categories that had already been stretched and blurred by loyalty programs, blacklists, and congressional hearings. Civil libertarians and some members of Congress warned that the law basically pre-authorized concentration camps on American soil, a kind of standing invitation for future abuse. President Harry Truman vetoed the broader McCarran Act, calling it a mockery of the Bill of Rights, but Congress overrode him, reflecting how powerful the fear of internal enemies had become at the start of the Korean War and the height of McCarthyism. In practice, the formal detention camps envisioned by the law were never activated, though the government did quietly select and maintain potential campsites, and the statute sat on the books like a loaded weapon. The very existence of that legal framework chilled dissent. If your political beliefs could someday be reclassified as a national security risk, it changed how openly you might express them. It wasn't until 1971, after years of protest, civil rights struggles, and a growing awareness of how national security claims had been misused, from FBI operations against activists to the revelations about COINTELPRO, that Congress finally repealed the Emergency Detention Act, acknowledging, at least on paper, that preemptive mass imprisonment based on suspicion and association had no place in a constitutional democracy. But the instinct behind it, the urge to carve out emergency exceptions where normal rights don't apply, has reappeared in different forms ever since, each time defended as a necessary response to some new existential threat. 25. The Civil Aeronautics Skyjacking Law. If the Emergency Detention Act was Washington trying to pre-package a legal response to hypothetical subversives on the ground, the skyjacking laws were what happened when lawmakers realized that people with guns were already turning airplanes into moving hostage situations at 30,000 feet, and that the existing criminal code had been written for trains, stagecoaches, and the occasional stolen mule. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, hijacking an airliner was almost a novelty crime, a bizarre news story wedged between weather reports and baseball scores. Most early hijackers in the U.S. weren't terrorists in the modern sense. They were desperate individuals trying to force pilots to fly them to Cuba, or to escape charges, or to make a political statement by redirecting a plane like it was a very expensive, very slow taxi. Airline travel itself still carried a certain glamour. No TSA, no metal detectors, passengers walking onto planes in suits and cocktail dresses, so the idea that someone could just stand up mid-flight and point a gun at the cockpit exposed how unprepared the legal and security systems were. The Civil Aeronautics Board, and later, the newly created Federal Aviation Administration, didn't just issue safety regulations about engines and runway lights. They pushed Congress to treat air piracy as its own category, with penalties that sounded almost medieval. By the mid-1960s and into the 1970s, federal statutes made aircraft hijacking punishable by life in prison or even death if anyone was killed, and gave the government broad authority to prosecute hijackers no matter where the plane ended up landing. These weren't just symbolic threats on paper. High-profile cases, like the 1971 hijacking by the still unidentified D.B. Cooper, where a man parachuted out of a plane with a bag of ransom money and vanished, convinced officials that they needed more than tough sentencing. They needed to transform the experience of flying itself. The legal changes went hand in hand with the introduction of metal detectors, baggage screening, air marshals, and mandatory security checks, measures that were initially denounced by airlines as intrusive and unnecessary but soon became as routine as boarding passes. The skyjacking laws marked one of the first times federal criminal law expanded so dramatically around a specific technology, not to regulate what happened in a city or a state, but inside a pressurized aluminum tube moving through federal airspace. And while politicians sold the crackdown as a clear-cut response to a frightening new crime, it also set a precedent that the national security state would follow repeatedly. Use a wave of highly publicized incidents to normalize a permanent set of extraordinary powers over how people move, who gets searched, and what rights you leave on the ground when you step onto a plane. 26. The Postal Obscenity Rules. If skyjacking laws turned airplanes into spaces where different rules applied, the obscenity rules did something similar to the mail, turning envelopes and packages into moral battlegrounds where federal officials decided what ideas were allowed to travel. For much of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the United States government treated the postal system not just as a neutral delivery service, but as a tool for social hygiene, with the Postmaster General and his inspectors cast as national censors in uniform. The most notorious version of this was the Comstock Act of 1873, named after moral crusader Anthony Comstock, who believed that obscene material, everything from pornographic images to contraceptive information, was a kind of social poison that had to be kept out of the bloodstream of the nation. The law made it a federal crime to mail obscene, lewd, or lascivious material, But those terms were left vague on purpose, giving postal inspectors enormous discretion to decide what counted. Birth control pamphlets, information on abortion, sex education manuals, queer literature, even works of serious fiction that mentioned sexuality could be seized and used as the basis for prosecution. Comstock boasted that he'd destroyed tons of books, pictures, and articles of indecent use, and helped send hundreds of people to jail, including doctors and activists whose main offense was trying to distribute medical information to women. Because the postal system was national and nearly universal, these rules effectively allowed one set of officials in Washington to overrule local community standards and choke off entire streams of communication. Radical newspapers and labor organizers found their mailings blocked for indecency when the real crime was criticizing economic or political power. The Supreme Court mostly went along for decades, endorsing the idea that obscene speech had no First Amendment protection and leaving the definition of obscenity murky enough that fear of postal raids did much of the censorship work on its own. It wasn't until the mid-20th century, when courts began carving out more space for artistic expression, medical information, and eventually some forms of explicit material, that the raw power of postal censorship started to recede. But by then, the logic was well entrenched. If something unpleasant or controversial could be labeled immoral, the federal government could justify using the infrastructure everyone relied on, mail routes, permits, bulk rates, as a pressure point to control what ideas were allowed to circulate, all under the soothing claim that they were just keeping the mail clean. 27. The Sunday mail restrictions, if postal obscenity rules, were about policing the moral content of what moved through the mail. The long battle over Sunday mail was about whether the mail should move at all on the one day many lawmakers thought ought to be reserved for church, rest, or at least the appearance of both. In the early 19th century, as the young United States expanded westward, and the postal service became the main thread tying distant settlements to the rest of the country, postmasters routinely worked 7 days a week. Stagecoaches arrived when they arrived. Letters piled up quickly, and frontier communities depended on that steady flow of news and communication to feel less isolated. But religious reformers saw Sunday mail delivery as a kind of national sin, an official endorsement of Sabbath breaking by the federal government. They organized petition drives, packed Congress with memorials demanding an end to Sunday operations, and argued that the republic's moral health depended on shutting down the post office 1 day out of 7. On the other side were merchants, travelers, and many rural residents who saw Sunday mail not as a theological problem but as a lifeline. Delaying letters and newspapers by a full day might mean missing market information, legal deadlines, or word from loved ones in an era before telegraphs were common. Congress found itself debating not just schedules, but the meaning of the First Amendment's ban on establishing religion. In 1810, lawmakers had actually written into law that post offices were to be open and mail transported every day of the week, reflecting the practical needs of a growing country. Over the next few decades, repeated attempts were made to reverse that policy and impose a Sunday shutdown. Each time, committees issued reports wrestling with whether it was appropriate for the federal government to enshrine one particular Christian practice into civil law. One famous Senate report in 1829 flatly rejected the idea, arguing that religion was a matter for individuals and churches, not something to be enforced through postal timetables. Still, the pressure never fully went away. By the late 19th century, changing technology, railroads, and shifting social norms made it easier politically to scale back Sunday service without admitting that the religious lobby had won. The post office gradually reduced Sunday deliveries and eventually stopped most of them, while maintaining that the decision was about efficiency and cost, not theology. The Sunday mail fight is easy to dismiss as a scheduling quirk, but it foreshadowed later battles over which religious values get translated into federal policy and which get left at the church door. And it showed how even something as mundane as when your letters arrive can become a proxy for a much larger argument about whose definition of rest, work, and holiness the government is supposed to respect. 28. The 1807 Embargo Act. If the Sunday mail fight was about slowing down communication 1 day a week, Thomas Jefferson's embargo was about pulling the emergency brake on the entire engine of American commerce and hoping the great powers of Europe would be so inconvenienced they'd come begging for our business. In 1807, the United States was officially neutral while Britain and Napoleonic France were tearing each other apart, but neutral mostly meant getting shoved around by both sides. The Royal Navy was stopping American ships, seizing cargo, and impressing sailors they claimed were British deserters. French decrees threatened any ship that cooperated with British blockades. Jefferson, who hated standing armies and big navies almost as much as he hated direct confrontation, convinced himself there was a clever, bloodless alternative to war. If the U.S. simply refused to trade with anyone overseas, the loss of American grain, cotton, and other goods would be such a shock that London and Paris would change their policies to win back our exports. So Congress passed the Embargo Act, which in theory just said no foreign commerce, but in practice meant American ships were forbidden to leave American ports for almost any reason. Customs collectors suddenly became something like an internal police force, seizing ships, detaining cargo, and demanding bonds from merchants who'd built their lives on constant movement. The act hit New England hardest. Ports that had been noisy with shipyards, warehouses, and sailors found themselves eerily quiet as vessels sat rotting at anchor and unemployment soared. Smuggling exploded along the Canadian border and across the coastline, with boats sneaking out at night and entire communities treating federal officials like the enemy. Farmers who had been told that foreign markets were their future watched prices collapse and wagons back up with unsold grain. Jefferson defended the embargo as a temporary sacrifice for national honor, comparing it favorably to the bloodshed of war, but he badly misjudged who actually had leverage. Britain and France found other suppliers and carried on. The country that really suffered was the one that had just slammed its own doors shut. Within a year or two, even Jefferson's allies were calling the law the Ogravme, an anti-embargo political cartoon's joke spelling of embargo backwards, with a snapping turtle labeled Ogravme, biting a startled merchant. By 1809, the pressure was so intense that Congress quietly repealed the act, replacing it with a much weaker set of restrictions. The grand experiment in economic coercion without bullets had mostly demonstrated that a young, trade-dependent republic could hurt itself far more effectively than it could punish distant empires, and that when the federal government decides to weaponize commerce, the first casualties are usually the people who live on the waterfront. 29. The Non-Intercourse Act. If the Embargo Act was Jefferson's attempt at a nationwide lockout that mostly trapped Americans inside their own economic house, the Non-Intercourse Act was the sheepish, half-step retreat that tried to reopen the door without admitting the whole strategy had been a disaster. When Jefferson left office and James Madison took over in 1809, Congress faced a country furious at lost income, idle ships, and a thriving underground economy that had turned ordinary merchants into smugglers out of sheer necessity. No one seriously believed the original embargo had forced Britain or France to rethink anything. But the political class wasn't ready to abandon the dream that trade policy alone could compel respect. So they passed the Non-Intercourse Act, a name that sounds like a punchline until you remember that in early 19th century legal language, intercourse just meant commerce and communication. On paper, this law looked like a precision tool instead of a sledgehammer. It reopened American trade with the rest of the world while keeping the ban in place for just two countries, Britain and France, until they agreed to stop harassing neutral shipping. The idea was that by restoring business with other markets, the U.S. could relieve domestic pressure while still signaling that the main offenders wouldn't get away with their behavior. In practice, it turned customs officers into something between detectives and hall monitors, trying to figure out which cargoes were truly destined for neutral ports and which were simply taking the long way around to get to British or French hands. Merchants, who had already spent 2 years perfecting the art of creative paperwork, flag switching, and circuitous routes, treated the new law as just another obstacle to be worked around. Ships would sail under the pretense of heading to Spain or Portugal, then quietly divert to British-controlled harbors. Goods would be reshipped through neutral ports in ways that were technically legal but completely undermined the act's intent. Britain and France, locked in their existential struggle, barely blinked. From their perspective, American non-importation measures were a minor annoyance compared to blockades, invasions, and continental decrees. The Non-Intercourse Act did succeed in one sense. It slightly lessened the domestic outcry by letting some commerce resume, which helped Madison politically. But as foreign policy, it was another lesson in how small the United States still was in global power terms, and how difficult it is to design smart sanctions when enforcement relies on a patchwork of coastal patrols, easily forged manifests, and wishful thinking. Within a couple of years, Congress would try yet another variation on the theme, Macron's Bill Number 2, dangling promises of resumed trade to whichever empire blinked first, only to stumble into the War of 1812 anyway. The Non-Intercourse Act thus sits in that awkward family of laws where the name sounds strange. The logic sounds clever on paper, and the real-world effect is to prove that trying to use the customs code as a weapon against global superpowers mostly ends up cutting domestic commerce instead. 30. The Force Act of 1833. If the early embargo and non-intercourse experiments were about using federal economic power against foreign governments, the Force Act of 1833 was about turning that same machinery inward, aimed at a rebellious state that decided it could selectively unplug itself from national law. By the early 1830s, South Carolina's political elite had worked themselves into a fury over federal tariffs that they claimed unfairly protected northern manufacturers at the expense of southern planters. Led by John C. Calhoun, they dusted off the theory of nullification, the idea that a state could declare a federal law unconstitutional within its borders and simply refuse to enforce it, a kind of controlled secession without formally walking out of the Union. In 1832, a state convention declared the tariff laws null and void in South Carolina and threatened that if the federal government tried to collect duties by force, the state would consider itself no longer bound by the Constitution. This put President Andrew Jackson, a slaveholding Southerner who nonetheless had an almost mystical devotion to the Union, in the position of having to decide whether to let one state effectively veto national economic policy. Jackson's response was not subtle. In his famous proclamation to the people of South Carolina, he called nullification incompatible with the existence of the Union and warned that disunion by armed force was treason. To back up those words, his allies in Congress drafted what became known as the Force Act, a law that specifically authorized the president to use whatever means were necessary to ensure customs duties were collected. It expanded federal authority to move revenue collection from potentially hostile state ports to federal ships offshore, allowed the use of the Army and Navy to protect customs officers, and tweaked legal procedures so that federal officials couldn't be easily harassed in state courts. Critics saw it as a blank check for military occupation, a terrifying precedent that Washington could roll troops into any state that balked at federal policy. Supporters argued that the alternative was letting the Union dissolve, the first time a state legislature didn't like a tax. Behind the scenes, cooler heads worked on a compromise tariff that would gradually lower rates and give South Carolina something it could sell as a victory. In a carefully choreographed piece of political theater, Congress passed the compromise tariff and the Force Act almost simultaneously. South Carolina convened another convention, triumphantly rescinded its nullification of the tariff, and then, just to make the point that it still believed in the doctrine, nullified the Force Act itself in a symbolic gesture. No shots were fired, no customs houses were seized, and the crisis subsided, but the law remained on the books as a reminder that the federal government claimed not just the right to write tariff schedules, but the power to send soldiers and warships to enforce them. The Force Act was a dress rehearsal for the much bloodier confrontations to come, showing that underneath the abstract debates about states' rights and federal power was a very concrete question. When push came to shove, would Washington use armed force to make national economic laws real in places that openly rejected them? In 1833, the answer was yes in principle, even if the guns never had to fire in practice. 31. The Guano Islands Act of 1856. If the Force Act was about how far the federal government would go to keep one state from dodging tariffs, the Guano Islands Act was about how far it would go to help private citizens grab piles of bird poop in the middle of nowhere and quietly turn them into American possessions. In the mid-19th century, guano, centuries of accumulated seabird droppings baked into thick white crusts on remote tropical islands, was basically gold dust for farmers. Before synthetic fertilizers, guano was one of the most effective ways to restore exhausted soil, and global demand exploded. Peru, which controlled some of the richest deposits, made a killing exporting it and jealously guarded its monopoly. American farmers and merchants wanted in, and they lobbied Congress to do something about it. So in 1856, lawmakers passed a statute that said, in essence, if any U.S. citizen discovered an unclaimed, uninhabited island with guano deposits, they could report it to the government, and the president was authorized to treat that island as if it belonged to the United States, for as long as the guano was being mined. No treaty, no war, No real debate about imperialism, just congratulations on your bird dung rock. The Navy might back you up now. The law promised protection for American claimants, allowed the use of U.S. force to defend their operations, and gave federal courts jurisdiction over crimes committed there. Over the next decades, entrepreneurs discovered dozens of tiny specks of land across the Caribbean and the Pacific, staked flags, and started digging. Some of these claims lapsed when the guano ran out, or better fertilizer methods appeared. Others evolved into long-term disputes. A few, like Navassa Island near Haiti and Baker and Howland Islands in the Pacific, are still technically U.S. territories today because someone once decided the bird droppings were worth the paperwork. The Guano Islands Act turned resource extraction into a kind of do-it-yourself micro-colonialism kit. Find an island, send a letter, get the implicit backing of the U.S. government, and strip mine a natural resource until it's gone. It was sold as a practical agricultural policy, a way to keep American crops competitive, but in practice it blurred the line between private commercial schemes and national expansion, extending American reach over far-flung bits of the globe, not through grand strategic designs, but through the humbler, stranger logic of fertilizer shortages and entrepreneurial guano hunters. 32. The Pacific Railway Acts. If the Guano Islands Act quietly scattered American claims across remote ocean rocks in the name of fertilizer, the Pacific Railway Acts loudly carved a steel spine across the continent in the name of progress, using land and loans on a scale that would make any modern corporate subsidy package look modest. In the 1860s, with the Civil War raging, Congress decided the best time to finally build a transcontinental railroad was right now, when southern states that had previously blocked big federal infrastructure schemes were out of the Union. The basic problem was simple. It was incredibly expensive and risky to lay tracks through thousands of miles of mountains, plains, and desert, where there were very few paying customers yet. Private investors alone weren't eager to shoulder that kind of upfront cost. So in 1862 and 1864, Congress passed a series of Pacific Railway Acts that solved the problem by essentially turning the railroad companies into land companies with trains attached. For every mile of track they completed, the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads were granted huge swaths of public land along the route, alternating sections that created a checkerboard pattern of private and federal ownership stretching out from the rails. They also received federal bonds, low-interest loans per mile of track, with higher amounts in especially difficult terrain. The theory was that the companies could sell off their new land grants to settlers, towns, and speculators, using the proceeds to pay for construction and repay the government. In reality, the arrangement produced exactly the kind of frenzied speculation and corner-cutting you'd expect from corporations handed enormous assets in sparsely regulated territory. Charges of overbilling, unsafe construction, and political bribery dotted the project. The Crédit Mobilier scandal, where insiders used a construction company they controlled to siphon profits and bribe members of Congress, was just the most notorious example. On the ground, the empty lands being handed out were, of course, not empty at all. They were homelands for numerous native nations who would face intensified pressure, broken treaties, and violent removal as the rails and the settlers followed. Yet from the perspective of federal law, the Pacific Railway Acts were celebrated as a triumph of public-private partnership. A few pieces of legislation turned vast stretches of national domain into an incentive machine that flung tracks westward until in 1869, the last spike was driven at Promontory Summit in Utah. The railroad knit the coasts together, transformed travel times from months to days, and opened up massive new flows of commerce. But it did so on the back of some of the biggest land giveaways in U.S. history, a reminder that internal improvements in the 19th century often meant taking collective resources, handing them to corporations, and trusting that the benefits would eventually trickle back to the public that had just given away the store. 33. The Homestead Act of 1862. If the Pacific Railway Acts handed millions of acres to corporations in the name of connecting the coasts, the Homestead Act took a different bet, that giving land directly to ordinary people, at least certain kinds of ordinary people, would populate the interior, cement American claims, and create a nation of small property-owning citizens who would be invested in the Union's future. Passed in 1862, again with Southern planters absent from Congress, the law offered a simple deal on paper. Any adult citizen, or intended citizen, who hadn't taken up arms against the United States could file a claim for 160 acres of public land in the West. If they lived on it for 5 years, built a dwelling, and made improvements like farming or fencing, the land would become theirs for a small filing fee. To people crammed into eastern cities or poor European immigrants dreaming of their own farms, this sounded like a kind of agrarian lottery where the ticket price was sweat and patience instead of cash. In practice, the system was messier. Speculators and railroad companies maneuvered to grab some of the best parcels, often using dummy homesteaders as fronts. Land offices were underfunded and sometimes corrupt. The 160-acre plot size, reasonable in humid regions, was woefully inadequate on arid plains where rainfall was scarce and farming required much larger tracts or irrigation. Many families who tried to prove up their claims found themselves battling drought, locusts, isolation, and debt, and a significant number gave up before earning title. And again, the official fiction that this was unoccupied public land depended on ignoring the native nations who had long lived, hunted, and traveled there. Homesteading went hand in hand with forced removals, broken treaties, and the steady squeezing of indigenous people into smaller and smaller reservations as fences, plows, and windmills spread. Yet the Homestead Act did, over the course of decades, succeed in its political goal. It scattered millions of small landowners across the West, tying them legally and emotionally to the federal government that had granted their property. Over 270 million acres, an area roughly the size of Texas and California combined, would ultimately be claimed under its terms. The law created multi-generational farmsteads and ranches, fueled waves of immigration, and embedded the ideal of the self-reliant homesteader deep into American mythology, even as the fine print revealed how much that free land depended on dispossession, environmental gamble, and the quiet assumption that the federal government could simply sign over vast territories to whoever showed up first with a sturdy plow and a willingness to wait out 5 hard years. 34. The Timber Culture Act. If the Homestead Act imagined the West as a blank canvas waiting for small farmers, the Timber Culture Act imagined it as a treeless void that needed to be fixed with neat rows of government-approved saplings. Passed in 1873, it was Congress's attempt to solve 2 problems at once. Settlers on the Great Plains complained there wasn't enough wood for houses, fences, and fuel, and boosters believed quite earnestly that planting trees could change the climate, increase rainfall, and literally civilize the prairie. The law's sales pitch was irresistible on paper. Any homesteader, or even someone who already had a claim, could get up to 160 additional acres of public land if they agreed to plant trees on it and keep them alive for several years. The requirement sounded straightforward: plant a certain number of trees per acre, cultivate them, and after a set period, originally 8 years, with time and conditions adjusted in later amendments, you'd prove up, just like a homestead, and receive title. In reality, Congress had written a law about forestry for people who barely understood the realities of tree survival on semi-arid grasslands. Seedlings died by the thousands under drought, prairie fires, and grasshopper swarms. Many settlers, desperate for land, filed claims they never intended to fulfill, doing the bare minimum to give an appearance of compliance. Others were simply overwhelmed by the labor involved in planting and tending thousands of trees while also trying to keep their original homesteads afloat. Loopholes and lax enforcement turned the act into a magnet for fraud. Speculators hired dummy tree planters, filed false affidavits, or planted a few rows of seedlings and hoped an overworked land office wouldn't check too closely before granting a patent. By the time the law was eventually repealed in the 1890s, millions of acres had passed into private hands under its provisions, but the empirical tree cover gain was modest at best. The Timber Culture Act is one of those strange 19th century laws that sounds almost wholesome, a government paying people in land to plant trees, until you look closer and see the usual pattern: optimistic science, weak oversight, a lot of paper forests on official forms, and another tool for converting what had been shared prairie into a checkerboard of private property, all in service of a theory that enough little groves might turn the plains into another Ohio. 35. The Moral Anti-Bigamy Act of 1862. If the Timber Culture Act was about altering the landscape with trees, the Moral Anti-Bigamy Act was about altering a religious community by law, drawing a bright federal line through the marital practices of the Latter-day Saints. By the 1850s, the Utah Territory, dominated by members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, had become a political and cultural irritant to the rest of the country. Reports of plural marriage, where some Mormon men had multiple wives, collided with Victorian norms and fueled lurid newspaper stories about the twin relics of barbarism, slavery and polygamy. Congress, newly freed from Southern pro-slavery influence during the Civil War, decided to take a swing at least one of those relics in the territories. The Morrill Act of 1862 did two key things. First, it criminalized bigamy and plural marriage in any U.S. territory, setting fines and prison terms for participants. Second, it took aim at the economic base of the LDS Church by restricting any religious or charitable corporation in the territories from owning more than $50,000 in property, a clear shot at Mormon communal wealth. On paper, this was framed as a law of general application, not mentioning Mormons by name. In reality, everyone knew who it was for. But the federal government, busy fighting a civil war, largely failed to enforce it at first. Utah juries, dominated by church members, refused to convict polygamists. Territorial officials sympathetic to the church found ways to stall. The law existed mainly as a warning shot, a statement that Congress claimed the power to define acceptable family structures in the territories and was willing to use criminal law against groups that defied Protestant monogamous norms. Over time, however, as Reconstruction gave way to a renewed focus on the West, the Morrill Act became the legal foundation for more aggressive measures. It opened the door for later statutes and Supreme Court decisions that would uphold the idea that religious belief was no defense to practices outlawed by the state. In doing so, it turned Mormon plural marriage from a strange regional custom into a national test case over how far the federal government could go in regulating faith, family, and property in the name of civilization. 36. The Edmunds-Tucker Act of 1887. If the Morrill Anti-Bigamy Act was a warning shot at Mormon polygamy, the Edmunds-Tucker Act was the full legal siege, designed not just to punish individuals but to cripple the LDS Church as an institution until it capitulated. By the 1880s, previous anti-polygamy efforts, including the Edmunds Act of 1882, had led to some high-profile prosecutions and the disenfranchisement of known polygamists, but plural marriage persisted underground, and church leaders remained defiant. Frustrated lawmakers responded with a statute that combined criminal law, corporate regulation, and political engineering into one sweeping package. Passed in 1887, the Edmunds-Tucker Act ordered the disincorporation of the LDS Church and the seizure of any of its property valued over $50,000 on the theory that such wealth supported an unlawful practice. It revoked women's suffrage in Utah. Women there had been voting since the 1870s partly with church support because Congress believed Mormon women were using the ballot to sustain polygamous power. It required civil marriage licenses and abrogated spousal privilege in polygamy cases, meaning wives could be compelled to testify against their husbands. The law also reshaped the territory's legal system. Federal officials gained more control over local courts. Juries could be stacked by excluding anyone who believed in or practiced plural marriage, and territorial officials who refused to enforce anti-polygamy laws could be removed. In effect, the act used corporate law to dissolve the church's legal personality, family law to pry into households, and electoral law to reconfigure who counted as a legitimate political participant. Over the next few years, the government seized church-owned temples, tithing funds, and other assets. Leaders were arrested or went into hiding. Families lived under constant threat of prosecution. The Supreme Court upheld the property seizures, affirming Congress's broad power over territorial corporations. Under this sustained pressure, church leaders issued the 1890 Manifesto, officially ending the practice of new plural marriages, and Utah moved towards statehood on terms acceptable to the rest of the Union. The Edmunds-Tucker Act sounds like an obscure 19th century statute, but it marked a turning point where the federal government used the full weight of legal tools, economic, political, and intimate, to force a religious minority to abandon a core practice, raising enduring questions about how far a majority can go in legislating morality against a dissenting community that lives inconveniently inside its own borders. 37. The Page Act of 1875. If the Edmunds-Tucker Act was about policing how already married people lived, the Page Act was about deciding who was even allowed to walk through the door in the first place, especially if they happened to be Asian women. Passed in 1875, it's often remembered as the first major federal immigration restriction law, but it didn't come labeled that way. Instead, it dressed itself up as a moral crusade against undesirable people, namely contract laborers, convicts, and women suspected of prostitution, coming from China, Japan, or any Oriental country. On paper, Congress claimed it was protecting the United States from human trafficking and vice. In practice, the law handed American consuls and immigration inspectors broad power to interrogate, humiliate, and exclude Asian women at ports, especially in Hong Kong and San Francisco. Any unmarried Chinese woman, or even a married woman traveling without clear proof of a husband's respectability and money, could be presumed a prostitute and denied entry. There was no real due process. A skeptical official's gut feeling was enough. The result was a chokehold on Chinese family migration. Men who had been recruited as railroad workers or miners found themselves transformed into permanent bachelors, unable to bring wives or start families on American soil. White politicians wrung their hands about the supposed immorality of Chinese brothels, while simultaneously enforcing a legal structure that made stable family life almost impossible. The Page Act also normalized the idea that the federal government could judge migrants' morality and control the nation's borders on racialized, gendered grounds, laying the groundwork for the Chinese Exclusion Act 7 years later. It's one of those laws that sounds like an anti-trafficking measure at first glance, but the lived reality was closer to a gendered exclusion regime, a statute that treated Asian women as presumptive sex workers and used that suspicion to keep them, and the families they represented, out. 38. The Expatriation Act of 1907. If the Page Act controlled which foreign women could enter the United States, the Expatriation Act of 1907 controlled what happened to American women who dared marry the wrong kind of man, turning the wedding aisle into a quiet border crossing where your passport could disappear the moment you said, "I do." Before the 20th century, there wasn't a single coherent federal rule about how marriage affected women's citizenship. Practice varied and courts muddled through. The 1907 Act tried to impose order, but it did so by hard-coding the idea that a married woman's political identity should simply merge into her husband's. Under the law, any American woman who married a foreign man automatically took his nationality if he was eligible to naturalize. If he wasn't, as in the case of many Asian immigrants barred from citizenship by racial exclusion laws, she became effectively stateless in the eyes of the U.S. government. She could no longer vote where women's suffrage existed, hold certain jobs, or freely re-enter the country without paperwork as a foreigner, even if she had never left the United States. The flip side was telling. American men could marry non-citizen women with no impact on their own status. In fact, their foreign wives often gained easier paths into citizenship through them. The law embodied a world where political allegiance was assumed to flow from the husband, and women's citizenship was so derivative that it could be switched off by a personal relationship the state happened not to like. World War I added a harsher edge. American-born women who had married German men before the war were treated as enemy aliens. Over time, pressure from women's rights activists, suffragists, and the practical absurdities of the law pushed Congress to backtrack. The Cable Act of 1922 began to undo the automatic loss of citizenship, but the 1907 framework had already done decades of damage, quietly shrinking the category American citizen for women in ways that would have sounded surreal if applied to men. 39. The Cable Act of 1922. If the Expatriation Act of 1907 slammed the door on women's independent citizenship, the Cable Act of 1922 cracked it back open, but only part way, and with a tangle of caveats that showed just how reluctant Congress was to give up the idea that marriage should be a sorting mechanism for loyalty. Officially titled the Married Women's Independent Nationality Act, it was celebrated by women's rights advocates as a long overdue correction. At last, an American woman would no longer automatically lose her citizenship simply for marrying a foreign man. The law declared that, as a general rule, a woman's nationality would no longer follow her husband's as a matter of course. But then came the fine print. The new protections did not apply if the husband was ineligible to citizenship, a phrase that folded in the era's racial restrictions on naturalization. So an American woman who married a European immigrant generally kept her citizenship. An American woman who married a Chinese, Japanese, or other Asian man, still barred from naturalizing under federal law, could still be stripped of hers. The statute also created a patchwork of rules about how and when a woman who had already lost her citizenship under the 1907 Act could regain it, often requiring naturalization processes as if she had never been American at all. In some cases, Women found themselves treated as brand new immigrants to the country where they'd been born and raised, complete with residency requirements and loyalty oaths. The Cable Act thus operated like a half apology wrapped in ongoing discrimination. It acknowledged that the old system of automatic expatriation was unfair, but it refused to extend full equality in a way that might undermine existing racial immigration hierarchies. Over the next decade, amendments gradually removed some of the racial and marital restrictions, and by the mid-1930s, the most glaring inequalities between men's and women's citizenship rules had been formally erased. Yet the Cable Act's layered compromises capture a transitional moment when the law tried to reconcile a new idea that women were independent political persons with an older architecture built on coverture, racial exclusion, and the assumption that the home and by extension the nation should have only one formal head. 40. The Daylight Saving Time Act of 1918. If the Cable Act was about deciding whose identity the government could reset with a signature, the Daylight Saving Time Act was about deciding when, exactly, everyone's day would begin and end, and doing it with the blunt force of wartime patriotism. Before World War I, daylight saving was mostly a quirky idea floated by reformers and adopted here and there by local governments or railroads that liked the efficiency. Most people just set their clocks by the sun and local habit. In 1918, with the United States deep into the war and obsessed with wringing every usable unit of productivity and fuel out of the home front, Congress took that scattered practice and imposed it nationwide. The logic was simple on paper. Move the clocks forward in the spring so people would use less artificial light in the evenings, saving coal for factories and the military. The law paired daylight saving with the first federal standardization of time zones, knitting local schedules into a single, national grid of hours in the name of efficiency and victory. Not everyone was thrilled. Farmers complained that the cows did not care what Congress thought about sunrise, and many rural communities saw the law as another example of urban industrial priorities overriding agrarian life. After the war, popular resistance helped push Congress to repeal the national daylight saving requirement in 1919 over President Wilson's veto, dumping the issue back to cities and states. But the precedent was set. The federal government had claimed the authority to tell an entire country to spring forward and fall back, not as a matter of science, but as a matter of legislation, turning the clock itself into an instrument of national policy that would keep returning every time leaders wanted to squeeze more efficiency out of people's lives. 41. The Standard Time Act. Underneath the headline change of daylight saving, the same 1918 law quietly did something even more basic. It took the messy, overlapping world of local times and railroad times that had grown up over the 19th century and locked it into federal statute. Before railroads, each town more or less used sun time, setting noon when the sun was highest overhead. Once trains started running long distances on tight schedules, that system became chaos. So in 1883, the major railroads got together, and without waiting for Congress, carved the continental United States into standardized time zones so their timetables would make sense. For decades, there was this strange dual reality. Railroad time and local legal time coexisted, with many towns informally following the railroad while the law on the books still pretended the sun was in charge. The Standard Time Act finally caught federal law up to practical reality by giving the Interstate Commerce Commission the power to define and regulate time zones nationwide. The justification was interstate commerce and safety, but the effect was bigger. It meant that something as intimate as the hour printed on your pocket watch or kitchen clock was now, at least in part, a creature of federal regulation. Time became infrastructure, like rail lines and telegraph wires, something the government could redraw and reorganize as needed. Later amendments would tinker with the map, add and shift zones, and eventually move oversight to the Department of Transportation. But the basic premise remained the same. What had started as a practical workaround by private companies became a legal framework that told every courthouse, school, factory, and farm which minute counted as official, folding the very rhythm of daily life into national law. 42. The Oleomargarine Act of 1886. If setting the nation's clocks showed how far Congress was willing to go in managing the abstract commodity of time, the Oleomargarine Act of 1886 showed how far it was willing to go in managing something much more tangible, what people put on their bread. Margarine, originally developed in France as a cheaper substitute for butter, arrived in the United States in the late 19th century and quickly terrified dairy interests, It was made from animal fats and later vegetable oils, could be produced in factories, and with a little coloring, could look almost indistinguishable from butter at a fraction of the price. Rather than just compete, the butter industry lobbied for the federal government to step in and kneecap its rival. Congress obliged. The Oleomargarine Act imposed a federal excise tax on margarine, required manufacturers and dealers to be federally licensed, and demanded detailed labeling and record-keeping that conveniently made production and distribution more expensive and legally risky. Later amendments encouraged states to go even further, banning yellow coloring in margarine so it had to be sold in unappetizing white, or requiring consumers to mix in dye packets at home like a weird kitchen chemistry experiment. Officially, lawmakers framed the act as a truth in labeling measure to protect consumers from fraud. In practice, it was economic protectionism dressed up as food safety, a way for a powerful agricultural lobby to weaponize tax and regulatory law against a competitor. Court battles chipped away at the harshest provisions over time, and margarine eventually became a normal grocery store staple. But the act remains an early, vivid example of how the federal government could use its taxing power to shape the marketplace, not just by raising revenue, but by picking winners and losers right down to the spread on your morning toast. 43. The Filled Milk Act of 1923. If the Oleomargarine Act was dairy's first big swing at crushing a cheaper rival, the Filled Milk Act of 1923 was its follow-up punch, aimed squarely at anybody who dared to imitate milk itself. Filled milk sounded sinister, but all it really meant was skim milk, milk with the cream removed, mixed with vegetable oils or other non-dairy fats to make a cheaper, shelf-stable product that looked and cooked like the real thing. It was especially popular among poorer families who wanted something vaguely milk-like without paying whole milk prices. Dairy interests painted it as nutritional sabotage and a moral threat, claiming it would trick mothers, stunt children, and undermine the health of the nation, all while quietly worrying that it would undermine their market share. Congress responded by banning the interstate shipment of filled milk altogether, not just regulating or labeling it, but effectively turning an entire category of food into contraband the moment it crossed the state line. The justification was protecting public health from supposedly dangerous imitation products, even though the science was flimsy and heavily shaped by industry-funded fear. For decades, small manufacturers and grocers who dealt in filled milk products walked a legal tightrope, and consumers in some regions simply lost access to cheaper alternatives. It took Supreme Court challenges and changing nutritional science in the mid-20th century to slowly erode the law's force, but by then the pattern was familiar. Behind a lot of high-minded talk about safety and purity, economic protectionism had once again been written directly into federal law, dictating not just what could be sold, but what poorer Americans were allowed to substitute into their own kitchens. 44. The White Slave Traffic Act, Mann Act. If the Filled Milk Act was about the fear of imitation foods corrupting bodies, the White Slave Traffic Act of 1910, better known as the Mann Act, was about the fear of immorality corrupting souls, wrapped in some of the most lurid moral panic language Congress ever printed. At the turn of the 20th century, reformers and newspapers whipped up hysteria about white slavery, a supposed nationwide conspiracy to kidnap innocent young white women and force them into prostitution, often with racialized stories about foreign men and big city vice. There were real abuses in the sex trade, but the imagery went far beyond that, turning consensual relationships that offended local norms into part of a vast, shadowy network of seduction and ruin. The Mann Act made it a federal crime to transport women or girls across state lines, for the purpose of prostitution or debauchery, or for any other immoral purpose, a phrase so vague it practically begged to be stretched. Almost immediately, federal prosecutors used it not just against traffickers, but against men whose private relationships offended someone in power. Interracial couples, unmarried lovers, even spouses caught up in messy divorces. The same law that was advertised as a shield against forced prostitution became a tool to enforce racial boundaries and sexual conformity, putting the FBI in the business of policing bedrooms under the banner of protecting women. Over the decades, high-profile Mann Act cases snared figures like boxer Jack Johnson and musicians and actors whose real crime was crossing moral lines, not state lines. Later amendments narrowed the law's language and removed some of the most archaic moral panic phrasing, but the episode stands as a reminder that when Congress writes immorality into federal statute, it also hands law enforcement a blank check to decide who counts as immoral. 45. The Leper Act of 1898. If the Mann Act turned moral fear into a federal crime, the Leper Act of 1898 turned medical fear into federal isolation policy, with Hawaii as its testing ground. In the late 19th century, leprosy, now known as Hansen's disease, was poorly understood and wildly stigmatized, seen less as an infection and more as a kind of living curse. In the Hawaiian Kingdom, and later under U.S. control, authorities responded with brutal simplicity: identify people with leprosy and exile them to remote colonies, most notoriously the settlement on the Kalaupapa Peninsula of Molokai, where patients were separated from their families and expected to die out of sight. When the United States formally annexed Hawaii, it inherited this system of segregation and the anxieties that justified it. The Leper Act of 1898 poured federal money into a national leprosy hospital and effectively endorsed the idea that the proper way to handle the disease was to isolate sufferers from the rest of society, codifying what had been a patchwork of territorial and local practices. On paper, it sounded like public health investment, a specialized institution, research, and a coordinated response to a feared disease. In practice, it meant Washington was willing to underwrite and formalize a system where civil liberties could be stripped on diagnosis, and entire communities, often native Hawaiian and Asian immigrants, were marked as dangerous. Over time, as medicine advanced and effective treatments were developed, the scientific case for mass isolation collapsed, but the human cost lingered in broken families, lost homes, and a legacy of shame. The law is a quiet example of how the federal government can turn anxiety about contagion into structures that last long after the fear is obsolete, and how protecting the public has often meant sacrificing the rights of people already pushed to the margins. 46. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. If the Leper Act showed how fear could justify locking people away, the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 showed how fear of what we were putting inside our bodies could finally force Congress to do something useful, even if it took decades of poisoning to get there. Before 1906, the American grocery store and pharmacy were basically the Wild West. Medicine could mean opium syrup for teething babies, cocaine-laced tonics for female troubles, and alcohol-heavy nerve restorers sold to people who'd been told they never should drink. Food wasn't much better. Milk was patted out with chalk, formaldehyde, or dirty water. Ground coffee might be sawdust-tinted brown. Canned peas were dyed a vivid, unnatural green with copper salts. Labels were either misleading or non-existent, and if you got sick from a bottle of Miracle Cure, that was your problem for believing the label, not the seller's problem for lying. Reformers like Harvey Wiley in the Department of Agriculture spent years quietly testing popular products and publishing grim results, while muckraking journalists documented rancid meat, borax-washed spoiled food, and kids dying after taking soothing syrups made mostly of morphine. Public outrage finally boiled over after Upton Sinclair's The Jungle horrified readers, with descriptions of Chicago meatpacking plants. They were supposed to be shocked by labor conditions, but mostly fixated on what was going into their sausages. Under intense pressure, Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, which for the first time banned interstate commerce in misbranded or adulterated foods and drugs, and required that certain dangerous ingredients like alcohol, opiates, and cocaine actually be listed on the label. It didn't ban those ingredients outright, and it didn't require proof that medicines worked, but it was a starting line. The federal government now claimed the right to police labels and purity, turning "what's in this?" from a private guess into a legal question. The law created the forerunner of the FDA and slowly pushed patent medicine swindlers and the worst food adulterators out of business. At the same time, it reassured the middle class that the national market they were increasingly relying on to buy canned food shipped from thousands of miles away, or pills made by strangers, might not actually be trying to kill them. And behind the language of purity and honesty, you can see another pattern. Big, brand-name manufacturers often supported the act because it put smaller, fly-by-night competitors under scrutiny they could afford to survive and others could not, showing that even laws born from real public health needs can double as tools for shaping who gets to sell what in America's booming consumer marketplace. 47. The Meat Inspection Act of 1906. If the Pure Food and Drug Act went after what companies said about their products, The Meat Inspection Act of 1906 went after what was actually happening behind the slaughterhouse doors, or at least what the public now imagined was happening there. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle didn't just describe mislabeled sausages, it described rats ground into meat, workers falling into rendering vats, diseased animals being processed anyway, and floors slick with filth, blood, and chemicals. Sinclair later said he aimed at the public's heart and hit it in the stomach instead, but either way, the effect was the same. Letters poured into the White House demanding to know if this was what dinner really looked like. President Theodore Roosevelt, who initially thought Sinclair was a bit of a hysteric, sent investigators to Chicago packing plants and got reports that, while not as lurid as the novel, were bad enough. The idea that meat traveled across the country in sealed rail cars, largely unseen from hoof to plate, suddenly felt like a national security threat of the gastric variety. The Meat Inspection Act responded by requiring federal inspection of animals before and after slaughter for meat that crossed state lines, mandating sanitary standards in packing plants, and authorizing government inspectors to be physically present on the killing floors and cutting rooms of facilities engaged in interstate commerce. Unlike the pure Food and Drug Act's focus on labels and ingredients, this law embedded federal employees directly into private industrial spaces, making the government an ongoing on-site participant in the business of turning animals into protein. Consumers got some reassurance that at least the most visibly diseased carcasses wouldn't be shipped to their tables. Meatpackers got something too, whether they liked it or not, a federal stamp of approval that made their products more acceptable both at home and abroad. Smaller regional slaughterhouses, especially ones that couldn't afford to retrofit or didn't do enough interstate business to justify federally supervised operations, sometimes closed or scaled back, accelerating the consolidation of meatpacking into a few giant firms. So while The Jungle helped birth a law presented as a crusade for cleanliness, it also helped entrench the dominance of the very industrial system Sinclair despised, with Washington now literally standing inside the plants, enforcing standards that reassured the public enough to keep buying mass-produced meat instead of rejecting it altogether. 48. The Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933. If the meat and food laws tried to clean up what Americans were consuming, the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933 tried to control how much got produced in the first place, in a way that still sounds surreal when you remember the backdrop was bread lines and soup kitchens. During the early years of the Great Depression, American farmers were trapped in a vicious spiral. Overproduction drove prices down, so they grew more to make up the difference, which pushed prices down even further. Wheat, corn, cotton, and hogs sold for less than it cost to raise them. Farm foreclosures swept across the countryside while, in the cities, millions of people couldn't afford enough to eat. The federal government's solution was the AAA, which essentially said, "We'll pay you not to grow food." The law created a system of subsidies for farmers who agreed to plow under crops, leave fields fallow, or slaughter livestock to reduce supply, with the theory that higher prices would restore farm incomes, stabilize rural banks, and jumpstart the economy. In practice, the sight of cotton fields being destroyed, wheat being turned under, and piglets being killed and buried while people were hungry made the policy look, at best, morally upside down. Officials sometimes tried to offset the optics by buying and processing surplus food for relief programs, but the fundamental structure remained. Federal checks flowed disproportionately to larger landowners who controlled big acreages and could afford to participate, while tenant farmers and sharecroppers, many of them black in the South, were pushed off the land or simply never saw the money meant to compensate them. The Supreme Court briefly struck the original AAA down in 1936 on constitutional grounds, but Congress and the Roosevelt administration retooled it, and the basic idea of paying farmers to manage supply and stabilize prices survived in various forms, echoing through commodity support programs and crop insurance to this day. The AAA is one of those New Deal laws that reads like satire until you remember the desperate context. In an economic system where markets had collapsed, Washington decided that sometimes the path to national recovery ran through paying people not to produce what the public visibly needed, locking in a model where the federal government became a permanent partner in deciding how much of the American landscape would actually be used to grow food each year. 49. The Gold Reserve Act of 1934. If the Agricultural Adjustment Act showed the government paying people not to grow food during a hunger crisis, the Gold Reserve Act of 1934 showed Washington solving a financial crisis by basically confiscating the nation's favorite metal and then changing the rules after it had it all in hand. For most of American history, ordinary people could hold gold coins, gold certificates, and bullion, and the dollar was legally defined as a certain weight of gold. It was the ultimate real money for anyone who didn't quite trust paper promises. When the Great Depression hit, banks failed, people hoarded gold, and the financial system started to freeze. Franklin Roosevelt's administration decided that one of the main obstacles to economic recovery was the public's ability to grab onto gold and sit on it like a national dragon's hoard. First came Executive Order 6102 in 1933, which required Americans to turn in most of their gold coins, bullion, and gold certificates to the Federal Reserve in exchange for paper dollars at a fixed price, 20.67 an ounce, with criminal penalties for holding more than a small amount. Once the government had vacuumed up the country's gold, Congress passed the Gold Reserve Act, which transferred all that gold from the Federal Reserve to the U.S. Treasury and then, crucially, allowed the president to change the official price of gold. Roosevelt promptly raised it to 35 an ounce, instantly creating a large paper profit for the government in the form of higher valued gold reserves backing the dollar and devaluing the currency against gold in a bid to fight deflation. Ordinary Americans had already been forced to sell their coins at the old lower price, and were now legally barred from owning what had just become more valuable. Gold clauses in private contracts, promises that debts would be repaid in gold or in dollars equivalent to a certain amount of gold, were voided by law, shifting the balance between creditors and debtors by legislative fiat. For decades afterward, U.S. citizens could not legally own most forms of gold bullion. That privilege was reserved for the federal government and foreign governments, while the public was expected to be content with paper backed by a metal they couldn't actually touch. Critics saw it as a flat-out confiscation and a betrayal of the gold standard's supposed discipline. Supporters argued it was drastic surgery needed to pull a collapsing economy out of a deflationary spiral. Either way, the Gold Reserve Act quietly marked the end of Americans' direct relationship with gold and the beginning of a modern era where faith in the dollar depended less on a shiny metal in vaults and more on the willingness of the federal government to say, "This piece of paper counts, 50. The 1790 Naturalization Act, if the Gold Reserve Act showed how the government could redraw the lines around what counted as money, the Naturalization Act of 1790 showed how the very first Congress decided to redraw the lines around who could count as an American in the first place. And it did so in a way that baked racial hierarchy into federal law from the start. The new United States had just thrown off monarchy and written stirring language about equality and unalienable rights. But when it came time to decide who could become a citizen by choice rather than by birth, the founders got very specific very quickly. The Naturalization Act set relatively modest procedural requirements: 2 years of residence in the United States, 1 year in the same state, an oath to support the Constitution, but then dropped the key phrase: naturalization was limited to free white persons of good character. That meant no matter how long you lived in the country, no matter how hard you worked, if you were black, indigenous, Asian, enslaved, or otherwise not legally free and white, federal law said you could never become a citizen through the official process. Citizenship access to voting in many states, legal protections, the ability to pass property and status to children, was legally reserved for a specific racial category, and the government was now in the business of deciding who fit it. The good character requirement added another layer of subjectivity, giving judges and officials wide discretion to decide who merited inclusion among the we of we the people. This wasn't some obscure clause that got forgotten. That free white person standard shaped immigration and citizenship policy for nearly a century, and courts and lawmakers used it to exclude entire groups when new populations started arriving. Chinese immigrants, for example, could live, work, and pay taxes, but federal law said they could never naturalize because they weren't white. Similar reasoning was used against immigrants from India, Japan, and other parts of Asia. The law also existed alongside slavery, creating a strange legal landscape where enslaved people counted for representation in Congress, but could never be citizens, and free black people born in the United States saw their status precarious and contested. Later naturalization acts would tweak residence requirements and procedures, but the basic racial restriction endured until after the Civil War, and the 14th Amendment forced a broader definition of citizenship by birth, not just by naturalization. Even then, remnants of the 1790 logic reappeared in exclusion acts and national origins quotas well into the 20th century. The Naturalization Act of 1790 is one of those early laws that sounds dry and technical until you realize it quietly answered a huge question: who is allowed to become one of us? With a legal definition of us that was both narrow and explicitly white, setting patterns the United States has been arguing over and slowly, unevenly undoing ever since.